Hello and welcome to Rushing the Field, National College Football Show here from NBC Sports. He's Joshua Perry. I'm Nicole Auerbach. We are glad you're with us. You can find us anywhere that podcasts are delivered and also on the NBC Sports YouTube page. So much to get into, Joshua. Happy New Year. We got our quarterfinal games in the college football playoff. We had a couple blowouts, but we had some really interesting matchups and a double overtime thriller at the Peach Bowl. So much to get into. But first of all, it was a great week of college football. I think it was surprising. It was interesting. We saw incredible individual performances. It was kind of everything you want, except, of course, you'd like a couple closer games, including the game I went to at the Rose Bowl. Would have loved to see a competitive football game, but congrats to your Buckeyes there.
Yeah, I was shocked by how quickly that one got out of hand. Happy New Year to everybody. Hope everybody had a safe holiday. I agree with you on the games. I thought this round delivered certainly more than the first round did, even though there were the blowouts. It was very intriguing to watch. Also, some of the other bowl games out there too, and we're not going to spend time on it. I've been really impressed with bowl season, and I think a lot of it has delivered on fun. It's delivered on a little bit of drama, and it's given us some narratives that we can run with in the off season, which of course us in the media love to do, but also fans arguing on social media enjoy it. So it's been really good. I'm glad we get to cover it.
We will get into one of those narratives in just a second. As a little hint, there's just one SEC team left in the final four of the college football playoff. Just one. And Joshua, it's the one that wasn't in the SEC.
You're talking about the best conference in college football, the one that's unimpeachable. There's nobody can play better football than them. There's only one.
Yeah, we will get into that in just a second. Notre Dame had a lot of fun with that, by the way, and some of that SEC narrative and the SEC speed, physicality, all of that. Notre Dame was certainly the more physical and the better team in the Sugar Bowl. So we will go game by game a little bit later in today's pod. We will also give some big picture thoughts for the semifinals, which are kind of right around the corner. We had a little bit less than a week turnaround because of the delayed Sugar Bowl. So we'll go deeper into those, some real heavy hitters, like some big blue blood program matchups. I'll be at the Cotton Bowl for your Buckeyes, so Ohio State, Texas, and then Penn State, Notre Dame. They'll be playing in the Orange Bowl. So that will be Thursday, Friday of next week. We will have a full deeper dive also on this pod a little bit later in the week too. So we'll get into all of that. But we're going to start with big picture thoughts as we look at the quarterfinal games as a whole. So if you look at the bracket, one thing that immediately jumps out are the teams that advanced are seeded 5, 6, 7, and 8. None of the top 4 seeds advanced in this round. They were all conference champions, as was Clemson. Clemson got knocked out in the first round. So no conference champions. And it does include Notre Dame, who can't even play for a conference championship. But there is going to be, I think, a broader conversation about the seeding. I have said this. I've reported it. Everyone's expecting there to be a conversation with the commissioners when they meet. They meet the morning of the national championship game, and then they meet again in April where they do kind of like a debrief for the full season. Everyone does expect them to talk about the seeding issues and kind of how it shook out. Certainly, we've talked about it with Oregon and the fact that they should not have had to play a team as good as Ohio State as early as they did with the way that the actual rankings shook out. But one thing I'll say on this, and we can get into it in a second, is just that any decisions to change this for next year have to be unanimous. 2026 and on, it does not. But like Joshua, if you are the Big 12 or the ACC or any of the Group of 5 conferences, I don't know why you would agree to get rid of buys for conference champions. Your teams are going to be lower in the rankings. So if you agree to this, your teams are never going to get those buys, probably most years. It would take kind of a certain circumstance for that to happen. So I don't know. I think a lot of people are acting like this will be a formality, that they'll go 1 through 12 in the rankings, and Texas and Penn State would have gotten the buys this year. I don't know. I just want to put that out there. But I do think this is going to be a huge conversation, the fact that none of the conference champions are here in the Final Four of the bracket.
It is an intriguing thing about how they need it to be unanimous. And I totally agree with the idea that if you are, the power brokers in, as you mentioned, Big 12, Group of 5, ACC, that you wouldn't want to change it. it also, again, feels like it's not this idea of keeping first things first, which is we have to structure a postseason that would do the best job it can of crowning a champion, right? Like, I get that they have to protect their interests, but like, if you're not one of the best teams, you certainly don't deserve to get a bye because you're a conference champ. And I think us as fans, we were going to be frustrated by that if that's not something that will change. And I don't anticipate it will, for all the reasons that you put out there. I think this second round was the example, though, of the flaw in the structure of this thing. The idea that you had the at-large teams that were the ones that were able to have the most success, and had it been seeded properly, maybe these games would have looked a little bit differently. Maybe the paths would have looked a little bit differently. Maybe you get some other teams that get to advance to the semifinal. So certainly I think that I'm more comfortable with this postseason structure as we've gotten closer to it. I still think 8 would be the right number. I know that's not going to change. But one thing I do feel confident about is that the right teams that were playing in the second round were ultimately the teams that got to advance. I think they were the better teams that did the things that they needed to do to win the football games.
I agree with that. So here's one thing, because people, and we can talk a little bit more about kind of the rust versus rest piece of this, because people are absolutely going to make a lot out of that. I think it's going to be a big offseason topic about the amount of time that those teams that had the first round buys were actually off. But to me, the teams that were favored in these games won, right? So
Right.
for two of them, when we talk about seeding, we've been using Boise State and Arizona State as examples for that, where they were double-digit underdogs and they were the higher seeds. Well, the lower seeds won those games, but those were the teams that we expected because they were the two top at-large teams. Now, Texas, like, that was dicey, right? Like, that's a one play. They had a 4th and 13, and that was their season on the line. But those were teams that were expected to advance. And so to me, that's different. That actually brings the seeding question even more to light, because they should have been the higher seed in that game because they were ranked well above the teams that they were playing. But because they had to be conference champions, that's why it shook out. That's why there was a 3 next to one of them, a 4 next to the other. So that's where, like, I do think that stuff would have been fixed. Oregon would have probably, if Oregon was going to win a national championship this year, they probably were going to have to go through Ohio State, but they
Right.
wouldn't have met them this early because Ohio
Right.
State was seeded 6th. So you would never have had the number 1 seed playing the number 6 seed in the quarterfinals. That's not how brackets work.
Right. And I think the rest versus rust is a very interesting one, if I could bring that up right now. And I do think that it was more of it's not necessarily like how long they were off. I think it's the fact that some of the other teams had the game before to get in rhythm. Because if you look at the time Ohio State, for example, had between the Michigan game and when they played in the first round game, it was 21 days, right? You look at Oregon from the Big Ten championship to playing on New Year's, I think that was 25 days. So like 4 extra days in terms of the layoff between the first game that they had to play. It's not like they were off that much longer. I do think it is that rhythm, though, of being able to play in that first game, get back in the motion of things. Like Ohio State was already clicking. It was like they were back into the season. And I think the tough part about getting the bye is you don't have that ability to kind of warm up, and you're playing a team that already did. That was the biggest issue. And so it is a question that we asked. I think this is actually more of a path versus bye type situation where maybe it was a benefit to be able to, get your legs going a week earlier to figure out what you were going to be in the postseason, to get those hits out the way, to get the game plan going, rather than everybody gets to play and you're just sitting back watching. And now they're a little bit more comfortable and a little bit more in rhythm than you are.
I completely agree. I noticed it, and you could feel it. So at both media days at the Rose Bowl, Ohio State was incredibly loose. And I texted you about this. I said, like,
Yes.
Ryan Day in particular was super, super loose. So was Will Howard. So was everyone, because they did feel in rhythm. This was like, a week after they had just played the best game of the season. Like, you felt that. And they were only worried about kind of guarding against complacency with that, with like,
Right.
oh, we played really well. Like, we don't need to work that hard this week. But they obviously did a great job of figuring out and striking that balance to keep that momentum going. But Ryan Day talked to me and others, and he's talked about this a lot in the last couple of weeks, of like, we have seen teams that get into a postseason in the NFL, you throw baseball in there, they get into wild card games. And then they win them, and it just springboards you the rest of the way. And Ohio State believed that they could do that with this game, and they did, right? The Tennessee game, they were exactly where they left off is exactly where they started against Oregon. And then Oregon was like just settling into the game, and by the time they settled into the game, it was 34-0. So I think that game would have gone differently had Oregon played a week prior. They played like
I
SMU
agree.
or a week prior. They just wouldn't have the start of the game, I think, would have gone a little bit different. Like, I don't, yeah, go ahead.
No, that's what I totally agree with. Like, I do think that Oregon was the biggest thing that worked against them was they didn't have that confidence builder of that first game. They weren't able to get back in rhythm. And as we get into the recap of that game, the thing that I thought about Oregon is they fought back really well. It was just like insurmountable by the time they started. It was way too late, right? But like that was a team that should have been able to challenge more. And I think the way Ohio State was playing, they were probably going to end up winning that game. But certainly it could have been closer if Oregon had that rhythm that they found toward the end of the first half and into the beginning of the second half. If they would have had that maybe middle of the first quarter, we might be looking at a bit of a different game there.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't think that this was a factor in the Georgia game with Notre Dame. That factor was you have a new quarterback who is making their first career start, who, by the way, I thought played pretty well. I don't think he was the reason that Georgia lost that game, but like the defense was ready to go right from the start. So was Notre Dame's. Like that was not a factor there. And so I think it was an Oregon specific issue there where you had a long layoff. The other team was coming off their best game of the season a week prior. And to Dan Lanning's credit, he did not want to go there. Like, so he got asked multiple times about the long layoff, and he was like, that's an excuse. I felt like we used the rest time. We recovered. I felt like our focus was there. Our preparation was there, et cetera, right? So maybe, if more time passes, he would say like, hey, maybe it would have gone a little bit differently. But I don't think that coaches would argue against it. Like, I think they would still take the bye over having to play a game, the risk of injury. Like, it didn't factor in. Tennessee had O-line injuries in week 1 or in their first round where they were banged up, and Notre Dame lost Riley Mills for the season in their first game. And ultimately both those teams advanced. But like, that's the risk you run is like really debilitating injuries if you play an extra game. But again, like there was clearly an advantage to just like getting going, to getting back in the rhythm, to playing, to practicing with a game upcoming. I don't know. So I don't know where this is going to go. It's a small sample size, but it does feel like people are going to make sweeping judgments based on the fact that none of the teams with the first round buys won their next game.
And to the injury point too, like Texas is dealing with that right now. Their offensive line got banged up in their first round game. And, it's like, it's a real thing that people have to overcome. And it's like, it's going to be the great question about like, is the path the thing, or is having that time the thing? And I think that some of the matchups were already lopsided. So it's hard to use some of the matchups to determine that. But I mean, looking at Oregon, it really does feel like the bye might have been a thing that hindered them. And I do want to echo, Dan Lanning showed tremendous leadership in the way that he handled the post game. He was very complimentary of Ohio State in their program. And he also said, right? Like all the things that a coach needs to say when you lose. It wasn't about like the players didn't do this and my coaching staff was bad.
My preparation. I didn't have them prepared.
Yeah. I absolutely love that. I absolutely love that because I think there are other guys who might have taken the time to point fingers, and he's not going to do that. It's why everybody feels good about where Oregon's headed as a program.
Yeah, I want to echo that, having sat in there. And one other point that I want to make just for clarity's sake, because I saw the quote circulating kind of, and people were like, oh, he's bringing up Michigan for Ohio State. The question that Dan Lanning was asked, it was kind of a weird question, but he answered it. The question was like, how do you, like, obviously you're preparing for Ohio State. So you watched how they played against Michigan. How do you like see that team and the team that you just played? And so that's when Dan Lanning said, like, sometimes it's just not your day. This wasn't our day. And it wasn't Ohio State's day against Michigan. Like, he wasn't trying to like take a dig at Ohio State the way that I think some people acted like it was unprompted. But yeah, so he did not go there. We'll go there. We'll say the things about the long layoff moving forward. But again, I think it'd be interesting if the coaches give feedback to the CFP and say like, this was a problem or this was too long. I mean, there's other ways you could do this. Like, part of the reason there was a minimum of 2 weeks between the conference championship games and the first round is for health and safety reasons. Like they said, we're going to make sure that you get at least 2 weeks. It doesn't have to be 2 weeks. It could be 1 week. It could be, then you don't run into the NFL issue, right? Where you're playing games that go up against the NFL. So there's other ways to fix this if they determine that that is going to be something that they want to fix. Joshua, there's another narrative coming out of really the postseason as a whole, but certainly the college football playoff. The narrative is about the SEC. We have heard for so many years, and it's backed up by a lot of national championships, that the SEC is the big bad SEC. It wins all the national championships. It's by far the best college football conference. It's the deepest league, but also it's the best. And the best of the best are in the SEC. It was a narrative that we heard all this season, even though you and I were among those being like, I don't know if there's an elite team in the SEC. It's definitely deep because we saw a lot of upsets. But Nick Saban's gone at Alabama. That program has taken a step back. Georgia is not the same as like 2022 Georgia. Carson Beck was wildly inconsistent this year, but the defense wasn't as elite as it's been either. Usually it's like number one in the country in so many different categories. It's like in the 40s in a lot of categories. And so we had this conversation, and then the SEC, its media apparatus, its coaches, most notably Lane Kiffin, because we heard from Lane Kiffin a lot, were arguing, Alabama should have been in, or Ole Miss, or South Carolina. There was a point in the year where it was like maybe 5 SEC teams should be in the 12-team bracket. And it felt like this wasn't the year to have those arguments because the top wasn't elite. As we sit here heading into the final 4 teams in the semifinals of the college football playoff, there's only one team left. It's Texas. This was a team that was not in the SEC last year, that people said, oh, it's going to be an adjustment. It's going to take the physicality and the week in and the week out of the SEC. It's going to be too much for Texas. Texas didn't even win the Big 12 most years. And they win the SEC, where they are the last SEC team standing. Georgia technically won the SEC. They won the championship game. But Texas is the last hope. Meanwhile, you had Michigan beat Alabama again, twice in the calendar year in 2024, but with basically none of their NFL guys playing.
Everybody opted out.
Everybody opted out of the game for Michigan. Everybody played on Alabama's side. Michigan wins. South Carolina loses. Ole Miss beat Duke, but the Big Ten, let's go Big Ten, SEC specific.
I just got to say real quick, do you remember when Brett Bielema was making the case for Illinois to be a playoff team, and then they beat South Carolina? Maybe Brett was right.
He was quote tweeting Lane Kiffin. Every take Lane was saying about like why Ole Miss or like a 9-3, SEC team should have been in the playoff. Brett Bielema was like, great points. And then here's where Illinois stacks up in all of those categories. And then they go and they beat South Carolina. And so again, like the teams that we had been like, all right, these teams are close, like, are they snubbed? They don't really have an argument. No. And that kind of went away with Tennessee's loss in general. But those teams in particular lose. Georgia, the SEC champion, loses to Notre Dame, a team that, again, we talked about this. The narrative had been for 30 years, every time Notre Dame's in a big game or plays the SEC, they get boat raced. Like they cannot handle that physicality. Notre Dame was the more physical team, was the tougher team in that game. So there is certainly a conversation, I think, that needs to be had about where the SEC is. And if so much of the conversation and the way people talk about the SEC is based on the past and not the reality of this conference, which is that it is not necessarily head and shoulders above everyone else. The Big Ten teams went 4-1 against the SEC this postseason. And then again, Notre Dame beats Georgia as well. There is definitely not a gap, I don't think. Certainly not this year, because there wasn't an elite team in the SEC. Texas Texas is good, but they got beat by Georgia twice in this season. So there was no one who was bulletproof. There was no one who was going to be, that carrying the flag for the conference in the way that some of those dominant Alabama teams or dominant Georgia teams were.
You mentioned the 4-1 postseason record. Like Iowa was right there too. Could have won their bowl game against Mizzou. Like I agree with you. It's really intriguing the way the conversation's gone. So like Notre Dame's got 2 SEC wins this year. They beat A&M to start the season. They just beat Georgia. You mentioned what Michigan did with the whole team that opted out. Alabama's team was playing. Like, there was a point in the second quarter where Alabama had 2 damn yards, and that was a team that I was supposed to believe should be in the college football playoff. Absolutely not. We watched what Ohio State did to Tennessee, and then we start to get into these other side conversations for all the people down south who were like going in on Indiana. Maybe Indiana just played the 2 best teams in the country, and those were the only 2 losses that they had. Like, maybe that's the case with Indiana. We don't know. We got to see the way the rest of this thing plays out. We're in a different time. And I think part of the SEC dominance conversation we need to be real about, since we're starting to move a little bit away from it. It was a lot of Saban dominance, and some other SEC teams certainly sprinkled in there. You had Auburn doing their thing, and LSU was able to pull off some titles. We certainly know about that in Georgia and what they had been. But it was really Nick Saban and what he did. And he's gone, and we see what Alabama is right now. And so that's part of it. The other thing, and people bring this up, and I think it's a legit conversation. You pay guys above the table now. You can't hoard talent, right? Like Urban did it at Ohio State. He came from that SEC model, but what you would do is you would recruit all of the best guys, and you would tell them, hey, you're going to start. You're going to come in right away. You're going to play. And then they get on campus, and you'd be like, well, actually, you're not that good right now, and we're going to redshirt you, and you're going to sit. And they had to make a decision. Do I sit here for a year, not play because I'm taking a red shirt, and then transfer and have to sit another year before I can play? Or do I just take my red shirt and then try to work my way on the field? You don't do that anymore because guys can just leave. And so they're not able to hoard elite talent. And it hurts the depth of these teams as you look at the rosters. And so now we're in a place where you got these other teams, in particular, Big Ten teams and Notre Dame, who are able to really compete because it's a more level playing field in terms of NIL. And like, yeah, everybody's got elite top tier talent, but then kind of after that, it's like, can you put guys in the right spot? Can you actually develop players to be able to step in? Notre Dame, bunch of injuries this year. They've developed well. Those guys go in, they play well. Ohio State, banged up offensive line. They ain't give up a sack yet in the postseason, right? Like, they've developed well. And all of those things tend to matter in the era that we're playing in. So I'm done with any of the narratives. I'm done with the conversation. And I was always a guy who would give the benefit of the doubt to the SEC because I do believe in talent composite, and that has to matter for some things. But the results of the games have to matter more than anything. And we saw what we saw this year, and we see the way that the postseason is playing out. You don't get to do it anymore. We have to evaluate each team on an individual basis, take the badge that's on the front of the jersey that says the conference off, and I'm going to look at you and who you are as a team, and I'll make my determination that way.
And we have to evaluate these teams based on the year that they are in.
Mm-hmm.
We don't get to say that just because the SEC has been dominant or has won X amount of national championships over the past 2 decades, that these teams this year get that benefit of the doubt. And I think that's one of the things that we need to take away from this, is that especially when you're in conference play, you're beating up on each other, it's hard to measure those teams against teams from other conferences. Like, strength of schedule is a flawed metric in college football because you don't have enough crossover games. Like, anyone who does data and data analysis will tell you that there's not enough. It's better in college basketball or other sports where there's more crossover, but there's not enough data points to have a really good measure of that this year. So what happens? You have, a bunch of teams that start the season with, we look at the rosters. We think
Sure.
they look really strong. We give them rankings. We consider them good teams.
Which we should do away with, by the way. The preseason rankings, I think, are crazy.
Preseason rankings are part of this because of the narratives and the way that we view these teams. But then, those teams lose, and then we're like, oh, well, maybe these other teams are also good. So then they jump into the rankings, and you go that route instead of necessarily evaluating maybe our initial reads on some of these teams are a little bit off, or they're based on past success, or they're based on things that don't actually apply to this team this season. And I think we need to have that conversation. I think people need to stop with the hypotheticals and the Vegas lines, because we've learned a lot this year. I mean, Alabama, heavy favorites against Vanderbilt, Oklahoma, and Michigan, and lost all of those games. So the idea of, well, who would win if they played on a neutral site, that needs to be less of a talking point as well moving forward, because what happens on the field matters, and it is more of an even playing field. This league is not necessarily head and shoulders above everyone else and needs to be treated as such. We need to respect teams in other conferences, and, a Notre Dame team that didn't have a terrifying schedule this year, right? Like it was very manageable. They lost to Northern Illinois. We heard a million times this year. Turns out you could still be a really good football team. You could be a great football team, even if you don't have as challenging a schedule as Georgia does, right? And I'm sure the argument is, well, the wear and tear of that. No, Georgia was not as good of a football team. They were not as complete of a football team as
Right.
Notre Dame was. Notre Dame had
Right.
all these uncharacteristic penalties, and they were still clearly the better team. They were prepared. They executed better. And that stuff needs to matter as we move forward. And I think it should matter in the way that we talk about the sport, the way we talk about different teams, contenders. And I'm with you completely. Indiana deserves apologies. They did not deserve the way that they were treated just for going first, where there were a number of blowouts this season, but also that they lost to a Notre Dame team that's really, really good. And they lost to them on the road. And they lost to Ohio State, a really, really good football team on the road.
Right.
It's okay to have that happen. And it's an incredible season for Indiana, regardless. But we don't need to say they didn't belong when it turns out that other teams are going to lose just like that, if not worse, to those same teams.
Yeah, I think we gotta get better at watching football, right? Like watching football and really evaluating what these teams are. I think that there were a number of people, if they wanted to be honest, and like national voices in this thing. Like Joel Klatt, I give a ton of credit to for the way that he evaluates football. And even some of these other guys who are a little bit more new media, Josh Pate, like he had some interesting takes from a perspective of evaluating football and saying that some of the teams that we're advocating for and saying that would be like definitively better if they got into the postseason, we can't know that because if you look at the team in the way that they played, like you don't know what version of them you're going to get, and they're very flawed football teams. And so I think the whole thing was misguided in the conversation to begin with, but like we have to get to a place instead of looking, the metrics thing really bothers me because it really takes away what happens on the field in a lot of ways. And it takes away like results and it distills it down to these numbers that are abstract in a lot of ways. Watch the games, evaluate what the teams are. What are their flaws? What do they do well? And then ask yourself the question, is this a team that is one of the best? Are they a team that can get into the playoff and we would trust them that they would be a good football team? And if the answer is probably not, then they just don't need to be there.
Right. And I think, just to wrap up this point, trust is really important, and that goes to consistency. So for all the people who are arguing that Alabama would definitively have given Penn State a better game than SMU or Notre Dame a better game than Indiana, there was no way to say that because they could easily have had the game that they had against Oklahoma where Jalen Milroe makes a lot of mistakes. And then, that exact game happens against Michigan, against a lesser opponent, a team that was not in the playoff. So that was always a possibility. So you can't assume that you're going to get the absolute best version of every team. But again, I felt pretty good about Notre Dame going into this quarterfinal game because they were consistent across the season. They were dominant for much of the last 2.5 months. So that's where, again, some of this stuff really needs to matter. You can't only look at teams at their peak. You need to look at them when they are at their low and then what they are week to week to week to week. And we said that so many times about the SEC teams that we did not know which version was going to show up on a week to week basis because things did not carry over much with them. With that said, let's move over to the game. So I want to make sure we spend at least a couple minutes on each of the quarterfinal games and what we learned about the teams involved, the team that won. Let's go in order, chronological order. So we'll start with the Fiesta Bowl, Penn State, Boise State. Final score 31-14, a little bit misleading because I think Boise State, hung in that game. Like they weren't out of it. And I thought they acquitted themselves well. Ashton Jeanty did not get much going on. It was not a good game for him. He fumbled the ball. He had a season low, 104 yards on 30 carries, just 3.5 yards per carry. Penn State really did control this game. It was exactly kind of how we expected it to be. But I thought that after, kind of the initial get used to the game for Boise State, like that they did play well enough. But the story to me is Penn State. Their path led them to this moment. We all thought they could definitely get to the semifinals. They beat a group of 5 team. They beat a team that was in the group of 5 last year. They did what they were supposed to do. This is a Penn State team that the barriers were removed. They did not have to go through Michigan and Ohio State to access the playoff. And they lose to Ohio State. And they still get in. And here they are. Like, this opportunity was given to them and they have taken advantage of it. And to me, that's the story for Penn State right now.
Yeah,
That they
and
did what they're supposed to do.
no doubt. And it's a big deal for them now to be in a semifinal game. I think this is the one where they really have to show up with their best stuff, because it's the one that can change the narrative the most. I do think there are a lot of people, and the real skeptical people would look at it and be like, well, they beat a group of 5 team and a team that just came out of group of 5. And I feel like we need to not do that, because we discredit James Franklin enough. He wins when he's supposed to, generally, right? And these were the supposed to win games. Now he's in one of those where it's like, maybe you're not supposed to win. It's going to be a tight game. I think it would go a long way for him to win this. In terms of the game plan for this one, I thought Penn State's defense did exactly what they were supposed to. They went out there, they made the game really difficult for Ashton Genty, probably looked as normal as he's ever looked. And then they made Boise State throw the football. And I've been saying this, I don't think Penn State's very dynamic secondary. I don't think they run very well. Boise State was able to throw the ball around. But when it mattered toward the end of the game, they were also able to take the football away. And so I thought the defensive game plan was airtight for them. I still have an issue with this offense. And Andy Kotelnicki was brought in to do very specific things. He needed to create a dynamic offense that had different movement, pre-snap, shifts, motions, and then different personnel groupings to really get players to rise above maybe how good they are, and the scheme could elevate them. And I thought there were many times where he got too cute, where your running backs are going for 7 yards a carry. And in particular, on inside zone plays, they are tearing the Boise State defense up. You want to drop back, throw a pass. You want to throw a trick play in there. You want to just, like, too many things that were unnecessary. That would be the thing that would stop Penn State right now. You get against a Notre Dame defense that is going to be much better than what they saw. I think you got to go to what's working, and you got to continue to do it. And if that means that you're handing it off and it's inside zone and you don't get to do some of the more creative things, like, that's what a great coordinator is going to do. They're going to play the boring game. And so I'm curious to see what the evolution of this offense continues to look like.
We have said this all year, though, that's been the question, right? Like, it's not just that, like, he's getting too cute or there's too much pre-snap motion when, like, there really doesn't need to be. It's that, like, the plays don't always make sense, and they don't always, like, Chris Sims would always say it, they don't string together.
Yes.
And that's very apparent when you're watching these teams. Like, Penn State should have been able to grab control of this game and make it not a game. Like, especially the way they started, it looked like they were teetering on that, where this was going to be a blowout. But it was Penn State's own play calling that kept Boise State in the game and allowed them to get comfortable. And again, it's not like they had a chance to win the game, but that they were in it. And it didn't need to go that way. Like, it felt like Penn State had the potential to blow them out, and they didn't do that because of what you're saying. They didn't kind of just like, all right, this is what we're going to do. We're going to do it better than you. Let's just keep doing it. They did try to get some brownie points, some highlight reel plays, right? Some different stuff that was happening that they didn't really need to do. So it will be interesting. And they are slight underdogs. The line I saw, I don't know if it's what it is right now as you guys are listening to this podcast, was like 1.5 points Notre Dame favored.
That's what I saw as well.
In the Orange Bowl. So, this is where it becomes a big opportunity for James Franklin, because no matter who you are, people are going to discredit those first 2 games because of the opponent, right? And I'm with you. Like, you deserve credit for winning big games, even if you're supposed to win them. Like, I think there was still a step taken for Penn State, but there are a lot of people that would say, like, there hasn't necessarily been until this opportunity here against Notre Dame. The idea where you could have a potential rematch with Ohio State in a national championship game, or Texas, right? Either way, like, from here on out, these are big, big games. And these are the types of games that under James Franklin, Penn State has not historically won. So that's where the opportunity comes. And if Penn State's offense, which has a lot of weapons, has great running backs, has an otherworldly tight end who can do a lot of different things. We've seen really good Drew Aller. We've seen, like, that kind of pro potential out of him the last couple of games. They're going to have to prove it against, again, an elite defense in Notre Dame. And that's what's really fun about this next round, is because of what's at stake here for Penn State, for them to prove it and for them to have taken advantage of a path. Like we said, yes, this was an easy path. Well, you know what? They made it look easy. They did what they needed to do to be in the position to get to the semifinal. I did want to say, too, I agree with you on the defensive game plan. They said it going in. Tom Allen said, like, it's going to be multiple guys. because you got to get Ashton Jeanty on the ground. You saw that. Like they were
Mm-hmm.
swarming to him to make sure that they could get him down because he's so good after contact. But I did want to take a quick moment and say Ashton Jeanty was a phenomenal college football player.
No doubt.
And it was very cool, regardless of everything else, that he got to end his career in the college football playoff. I think we paid extra attention to Boise State because of the expanded playoff, because they had the potential to make it. And so he did not have a great day. It was a really tough day for him. Penn State made it really tough on him. But what a career and what a season for Boise State. So I just want to make sure we gave him their due.
No doubt. And him signing autographs after the game and everything too. It's like, it's he handled the spotlight and being one of the best players in college football the right way. And I appreciate seeing that out of him as well.
All right, let's move to the Peach Bowl. The best game we've had so far in the college football playoff. I don't think anyone expected this. I mean, you and I are both high on Arizona State. So I think we were like, all right, this game will probably be better than the Fiesta Bowl. But I don't know if we would have predicted a double overtime game. The way that ASU came back in this game down 16 points in the fourth quarter, Cam Scadaboo just like completely putting a team on his back. I mean, he reached college football legend status with this performance. He had 30 carries, 143 rush yards, 2 rush touchdowns, 8 receptions, 99 receiving yards, and he threw a touchdown pass. 42-yard touchdown pass. Like, he was everywhere. Sam Levitt played really, really well, especially down the stretch as ASU came back in this game. And they had one play, a 4th and 13. They'd gotten the stop. ASU would be in the national semifinals. But they were not able to get it done. Quinn Ewers had a couple of great throws in overtime to get Texas to the win and to the national semifinals. First of all, phenomenal game, right? And we needed this. I think that was my main takeaway was after a lot of blowouts, we needed a game like this.
I agree. Totally agree. Like you know how sour I had been on this playoff format, but seeing a game like this, I think it makes you want to come back around. I typically don't like talking about the team that lost first, but I do think that there's a lot of credit that Arizona State deserves. And you mentioned Scadaboo in the game that he had. He willed that team back in there with his production and with the way that he fought. I mean, he's over there yakking on the sidelines, comes back in the game. Like, and the man looked like he was like physically giving it all he had. And that's what we love about this sport. And it certainly made a difference for them. For Texas, I thought it was really intriguing. And I think we have to talk about the officiating. I personally am not mad that they didn't call targeting because I understand how hard that play is as a defender. I don't think there was like a violent launch there. Certainly there was helmet to helmet contact, and it fits the letter of the law. They should have called that, and that makes a difference in a game like this. And we have talked so many times about officiating and how it impacts football games. And I think we need to move now, and there's been a conversation happening, and I'm glad it's happening. National standards of officiating, and there needs to be a little bit more accountability because it's unfortunate to see a play like that play into it. Texas was so interesting, though. They come out, Sark, the best play designer, best play caller in college football, the first 10 plays, right? Like the script was perfect. They got the looks that they were looking for, went down the field. They had the special teams play, all of that. And then you get into the meat of this game and their defense starts getting leaned on a little bit, right? Like they start getting punched a little bit and they're trying to find a way to punch back. And I think that their offense didn't like the way that they were getting punched too. And Quinn Ewers started to look a little bit uncomfortable in the pocket. He's trying to place these pretty footballs and they're kind of hanging in the air. I think we all kind of anticipated Arizona State was going to be able to get a takeaway there late in the game just from the way that he was spinning the rock. It is such a talented football team. And I think Sark is a really good head coach. And again, one of the best offensive coaches in the country. I think there's this thing about Texas where they want to play the game on their own terms. And if they can't do that, I think it becomes really difficult for them. We saw it twice when they played against Georgia. Vanderbilt made them play a game differently, and they struggled in a game like that. And Arizona State said, we are going to play how we like to play. We're going to do things our way, and we're going to make Texas have to play our game plan. And I don't think they like having to win that way.
Yeah, and it was clear, right? So you mentioned like the beginning of the game when they scored like quick strike drives, and they really weren't able to like sustain drives throughout the game. And so that's why, like, there was a point where, Arizona State was just absolutely dominating time of possession, yardage, like everything that was happening. They just weren't scoring all the time, but like they were clearly getting more going offensively against Texas's defense than vice versa. Texas does have those elite skill players though. So they can score at any point. They can strike at any point. They had missed field goals. Obviously the one at the end where right after that controversial no call on the targeting gives the ball to Texas at the end of regulation, they missed that kick. But there were there's definitely a lot that you can parse through that will be really interesting when Joshua, when we go in our deep dive of the semifinal matchups of watching Texas back and going a little bit deeper into things that were working or weren't working. But you're right. That was an Arizona State game. Like they were the ones dictating how that game was being played. And Texas is fortunate to have come out of it. And I think, again, this goes to that SEC narrative. This was an ASU team that people were like, oh, it's the Cinderella. They're not even ranked in the top 12, but they get a spot. They got hot at the end of the year. Like, oh, it's so great. Like, we love Cam Scattaboo, right? But they didn't deserve, like the SEC teams are like, oh, we're all better than ASU. And you go to the brink when you're one play away from losing to that ASU team. So lots to dive into further with Texas moving forward. But Joshua, should we talk about what happened at the Rose Bowl? It was, I guess, a rout at the Rose Bowl.
Is a route. Real quick, you mentioned Cinderella, and I just want to go on record as saying, I think I've come to the conclusion after a very small sample size, because this is what we do in media, that Cinderella in this playoff format is the blue blood team that has a really talented roster that screws around a little bit, right? They lose to another good team during the year. Maybe they lose to a rival in a game that they probably should win. And then they get into the postseason and everything clicks.
So I'm sorry. Are you saying Ohio State is a Cinderella?
I'm saying that's what this playoff does. That would be what we would consider a Cinderella for this playoff, because I'm not convinced that we're really ever going to get the group of 5 team who just makes a run, or like, the last conference champion that gets in and makes a run. I do think it's structured for these teams that had high expectations and maybe stubbed their toe a couple of times to just get really hot in the postseason and handle things extremely well. And all of a sudden, in most years of college football where they wouldn't have been able to compete for a championship, they might be the best team and they end up winning it. I think that's what that looks like, neither here nor there. But let's talk about this Rose Bowl rout. Ohio State defeats Oregon 41-21. I remember an Ohio State game where the Buckeyes beat Oregon 42-20. Very interesting on the parallels there. These dudes have been on fire offensively. They score on 6 of their first 7 drives. I'm watching the end of Texas and Arizona State, and then the game flips over to the Rose Bowl, and Ohio State had already scored. You're giving me the update because you're there. They had already scored. Oregon's getting ready to punt, and then Ohio State's going to score again. It's like, what are we doing? Like, it's absolutely nuts. 500 yards of total offense. Jeremiah Smith was ridiculous. 7 catches, almost 190 yards, a couple of touchdowns. Travion Henderson was really good too. He had the long 66-yard run. And it was an Ohio State defense that looked very different from the first time they played Oregon. That first game they played against them, they had 0 sacks. They had 8 sacks in this game, 13 TFLs total. Very physical. They were coming downhill, smacking people. And we talked about Oregon with the long layoff there, but certainly Ohio State has figured things out, and they are looking like the team people in the preseason said they could be.
Right. I think this was the team that we were all waiting to see. Like we thought that this was in there somewhere. And that's, I think, what was so frustrating with like all of those slow starts over the course of the regular season. And then the Michigan game where they weren't trying to throw the ball at all. It was this team was there waiting to be unlocked, waiting to be unleashed. And I still think it's like some of the best football that we've seen in years. Like if you look at like individual quarters, like the first quarter against Tennessee, maybe even I would say like a quarter and a half at the Rose Bowl, like it was 34-0. No, in no scenario, in no way of evaluating and talking and predicting that game, certainly we would not have been surprised if Ohio State won. I think if we had filled out our brackets after seeing what they were capable of against Tennessee, I probably would have picked them to win it all. But there was nowhere on my bingo card, nowhere in any possibility in my brain was 34-0 at any point in this game. And it was basically 34-0. Oregon is basically shell-shocked before they even can respond. And they did respond, right? They fought back right before the end of the first half, fought back a little bit in the second half. I think there is a credit to Oregon absolutely for that. But when Ohio State is playing like that and they are steamrolling their opponents, I don't know that there's anyone that can hang with them. Like, we're going to have like a week here I'm going to talk myself into Texas and how they're going to make it a game.
Right.
And there's a ton of talent there, as you just said.
No doubt.
But if Ohio State keeps doing this, having watched it in person, I just don't know what you do. Like, I don't know how you stop Jeremiah Smith and Emeka Ibuka enough. And you still have Travion Henderson. You still have the run game. Will Howard is so comfortable right now in what he's doing. Mm-hmm. They're calling great plays. Like, Chip Kelly was so aggressive in this game right out of the jump. And then a defense that, to your point, was all over the place. I don't even think they were like blitzing on some of those sacks and some of those TFLs. Like, they were just everywhere. And it's all coming together. Like, Dan Lanning was like, we could not move the ball. And also, like, they couldn't, like we couldn't stop them. It was both things.
Right.
And that's as simple as you could put it, but that's exactly what was happening in that game. And it's impossible. It's just like, it's like a freight train running at you. And it's so hard. Like, I don't know what you can take away if Ohio State is doing all of those things on both sides of the ball so well. This is an Oregon team program, by the way, that the last 2 years, they gave up 5 total sacks the entire season, last season and the season before. 8 in this one game.
Yeah. It's kind of ridiculous. And like, I keep going back to this idea that the Ohio State offensive line is still kind of the thing, right? Like, if you're going to try to beat them, you have to create pressure. But I've talked about Derek Harmon. I think he was the second best defensive tackle in the Big Ten all year long. And that's behind Mason Graham, who's going to be a top 5 pick in the draft. They had Twin Towers out there and Jordan Birch and Mateo Uiagalelei. Those guys combined for like 2 or 3 tackles in the game. Like, that's how you know it's just like they're on a different level right now, where they're going up against one of the best defensive lines in the country. And their weakness is the offensive line, and those guys don't really have an impact on the football game. I'm very curious to see how it continues to go. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to talk myself into Texas, making it a really tough game for Ohio State. But if Ohio State does what they've been doing, I just don't know how it works out. But there is a flip side of this, and I want to ask you this question. I think Oregon's still a really, really good football team, and they tried to fight their way back. It was just too little, too late. But they didn't quit in that game. You know, they tried to get some momentum. You told me that at one point the stadium got really loud on the Oregon side. And when you're fighting back from 34-0, it's hard to get everybody back invigorated in a game like that. But that's how good of a program Oregon is. How do you reconcile the regular season 13-0 Big Ten champs? They beat Ohio State. They beat Penn State. They went on the road and beat Michigan, who was not very good. But those were the 3 teams in the Big Ten. And then they get into the postseason and lay an egg.
Yeah, I think it's really tough because it was hard to go undefeated this year. They were the only ones who did it. Everybody else tripped up. They won their clunkers.
You know how I feel about how.
Yeah, you think it's actually relatively easy to win in the regular season.
I do.
But again, harder than for others.
No, it was especially this year. It was very difficult. I'm not trying to take anything away. It's just
but they did. They won their clunkers. They won their big games.
Mm-hmm.
They obviously had flaws. Like we saw them, but we saw them get better over the course of the season. We saw them prepare. Saw the offensive line and the changes that they made early in the season like really pay off for them. And Dylan Gabriel is just a really good, experienced veteran quarterback. But it's hard because I think that this is what always happens with the postseason. It's the last look at a team for a long off season, and it sets narratives and it gets people upset, especially the way you lose. It felt like people were immediately turning back to Dan Lanning can't win big games.
Right.
Even though we saw them, win that thriller in Autzen, even though we saw them, go and take care of business against Penn State, a team that is also in the Final Four of this bracket in the Big Ten championship game. I think that it is tough. It is tough to be like, hey, how does Oregon take that next step? Like, people thought that they did this year. People thought that coming to the Big Ten, the way that they were built, the way that they had played, that they had accomplished that they were prepared for this. And they felt that way. That's what they said at Big Ten Media Day, and at the Rose Bowl Media Day, like all the course of the season. Like they felt like they had built and prepared and developed for this situation. And again, I think a lot of it does have to do with you're cold. You're about to start your first game of a postseason against a team that was like already at 99% of their best. But it's a really tough thing to end the season this way. And with the amount of investment that went into that roster, Phil Knight factor and all of that, like it's hard when you have all of that and then you don't succeed and you don't even win a game in the college football playoff. I don't know. I don't know, necessarily like how you flip that or turn the page. I mean, I still think Dan Lanning is the guy. I like the way he's building. I like the way he coaches. I like the way he runs his program. But it's going to be a long off season, I think, in Oregon with just the amount of talent, the amount of investment, and all they had accomplished, the expectations that they were going to be able to take that big next step that didn't happen.
I'll say this is, and take this from somebody who lives it. When the only thing that you're concerned with is winning a national title, you're going to be miserable. There are going to be 133 miserable teams because there's only one that gets to do it. And they did something that nobody else in the Big Ten, nobody else in college football got to do. They went undefeated in the regular season, right? Like that's a huge deal. And then they won their conference title. So they get to hang a banner for that. I don't know how they do it over there. A lot of teams give out rings for that. Like there are things that they can hang their hat on. They came in immediately in the Big Ten and challenged to be the face of the conference. They had the coach who was challenging to be the coach of not only of the conference really, but of college football. Like had they made some noise here, that is the profile that they elevated themselves to in year one in the Big Ten. And so I think being disappointed is perfectly warranted. Like that was a tough performance to have to live with in the offseason. I also think that like you can get yourself into very miserable places as a fan base when you have a very narrow scope of how you would define success for a season. If that means a national title for a program, by the way, and this is not to take shots, but like you don't have that. That's not your heritage. You can get yourself real miserable real quick and saying crazy things about a coach who's doing a great job. So for Oregon, this is the building phase. You have to have these experiences to get ultimately where you're going. But it's hard for me to look back and say that they didn't have a great season because it was phenomenal there. But let's move along to the Sugar Bowl here with Notre Dame defeating Georgia 23-10. Notre Dame loses to NIU, and then they just go out and win 12 straight games. They got 13 wins for the first time in program history, which is phenomenal for them. Win their first New Year's Six bowl game in over 30 years, which is crazy. It was a very interesting game, and you said it off the top. Both of the defenses, I think, really played well to start the game. A lot of resistance. Then Notre Dame gets a turnover off of a strip sack, one play into the end zone. Then they're able to go into halftime, come out, return the kickoff for a touchdown. And all of a sudden, with the field goal before that, you're looking at 17 points that happened in the span of like 2 minutes. Notre Dame's a really, really good football team. And I feel like we need to center the conversation there. I think Georgia's really good as well, but like Notre Dame is just like that right now.
Yeah, they are. So this game was a rock fight early, right? 0-0 after the first quarter. Points were going to be at a premium because of how well the defenses were playing. Georgia was actually moving the ball better for much of that first half until that fumble touchdown. And you started that, obviously the kickoff return right after halftime. Like people always talk about the middle eight, the last 4 minutes of the first half, first 4 minutes of the second half. Can't really do it much better than 17 points in less than 2 minutes. That stretches between that. And it completely flipped the game. It allowed Notre Dame to play the way that we've seen them a million times, which is just like run the ball, play great defense. They were throwing it. And again, like it was tight windows. Like Georgia's defense was great. Like the receivers didn't have space, but there were some great catches. Like Jordan Faison had a couple great catches and he fought for extra yardage. But they were doing enough that they could then run it even without Jeremiah Love, who wasn't 100%, wasn't playing. But Riley Leonard is at his best when he's running and when he's fearless. We have worried about that with injuries. We have also said, hey, we want to see more out of him as a passer. You know, we've asked for a lot over the course of the season. But that run where he goes airborne and just like is like, whatever, I'm going to do whatever I need to do to get a couple extra yards for Notre Dame to help ice this game away, to help us get to the finish line here. That was peak Riley Leonard. That is who he is. And I think what we saw in this game from Notre Dame, there were a lot of uncharacteristic penalties, but you saw Marcus Freeman make some decisions and some really gutsy calls that said, I got my team's back. Like, I believe they can do this. We can do that whole like line change and try to get Georgia to jump off sides. And then they did, and it paid off. We saw him go for 4th down early in the game. Like, we saw Marcus Freeman coach to win that game. We saw a lot of things that we have seen over the course of the regular season, but maybe not everybody saw it, or maybe it wasn't nearly at like with this much at stake, but it was such an impressive win because of the way that they did it, because it was things that we have watched them develop and emphasize over the course of the season.
Yeah, and it's interesting with like the chances that Marcus took. And I think part of it is like young coaches are more willing to lean into like how they can win on the periphery of games. We saw it a lot with Dan Lanning through the course of the year. But like I think Marcus is kind of in that same mold of how he approaches the game. But there's also like this, you know, when you're Georgia and you've been there before and you've won the titles, there might be a little bit more pressure to just like straight up go in there and like not lose a game. Whereas Notre Dame, as we mentioned, like they haven't had heights like this in a little while. Like they're out there like actively doing everything they can to win football games. And I love that approach. I'll say this about Riley Leonard. So Jake Butt was an All-American tight end for University of Michigan, great friend of mine, great friend of yours. He always talked about Jim Harbaugh and how he would compliment guys. And he said, the greatest compliment you can give a player is to call them a ball player, right? And I think Riley Leonard is a ball player. I do not think he is a great quarterback. And it has not mattered for Notre Dame because he gets you the plays when he needs to. He is good enough throwing the football. That throw that he made into the end zone after they got the strip sack was a phenomenal throw. There was coverage underneath. He had to be able to get over that, and it had to fit into a tight window. He did his job on that. Doesn't make those throws a ton, but he can make them. But anytime they need a play, 4th down, we know who it's probably going to. It's Riley Leonard. He's going to keep the ball in his hands, and he's the guy that they trust in that. To your point, they're telling this dude, stop diving over people. Stop doing the flips. You're going to hurt yourself. And he's like, don't give a damn. We got to win. Right. Yeah. And like, I think that
they actually stopped telling him not to do it because they knew that it was pointless.
Listen. He's hard-headed. But he's a ball player, though. And I think that's the greatest compliment to Jake's point and to Jim Harbaugh's point that you can give a guy. He plays ball.
Yes, he does. And I think that, like, it has been really cool to watch him get more comfortable in the offense. He had 2 offseason surgeries after transferring to Notre Dame. And we talked about this at the time. It took a while for him to get into the offense. We were kind of tracking right hand and have a passing touchdown for, X amount of games in the early part of the season. But man, does he figure out how to win games and not lose them, by the way, not make bad decisions. And it is something special to watch what he is doing. And for Marcus Freeman, who obviously knew what was at stake, this was a program that had faltered at this stage, like a New Year's Six level bowl game stage for 3 decades. We talked about the way that they were physically outmanned and outmatched in a lot of those games when they would play SEC teams. And this is a coach that, yes, he's lost to some MAC teams and some Sun Belt teams, but man, does he coach well in the big games. Like sure these were the games that Brian Kelly could not win. Brian Kelly left Notre Dame, said
he said they couldn't win it.
That can win a national championship. Can't do it at Notre Dame. Brian Kelly is at home, and Marcus Freeman and Notre Dame are 2 wins away from a national championship, and they've got a roster that can do it. Like, that is a serious roster. It makes me think back about the day when they announced Marcus Freeman got the job and the way the players responded and reacted to Marcus Freeman being their head coach after Brian Kelly left them. Really, really, really cool. One other quick note before we get a little bit, I want to get a couple thoughts on the semifinal games as we match up. The Orange Bowl has James Franklin and Marcus Freeman coaching in this game. There has never been a black head coach who has won a college football national championship. This semifinal guarantees that there will be one coaching for it. There will be a coach in the national championship game, a black head coach, which is very, very cool.
No, it's history that we're watching here. Congratulations to both of those guys in the way that they've built their programs, the way that they've competed this year. But it feels like in the history of college football, it feels like such a long time that we're getting to this milestone. But Certainly glad that we're here. Two guys that I respect. Marcus, I know a lot better than I know James Franklin, but congratulations to both those guys on the seasons that they've had and in the history that they could make here with the win in the Orange Bowl.
So we are going to go deeper on those two games in the next week here on Rushing the Field. So you'll want to make sure to subscribe and get alerts on the pod because we will have deeper breakdowns. But, as we're rounding things out here, reacting to the quarterfinals, want to get some early thoughts on those semifinal games. So let's stick with the Orange Bowl first, since we were just talking about Notre Dame. The Irish are slight favorites right now as we're recording this Friday morning. They are 1.5-point favorites over Penn State. I think we've kind of set up the narratives here about Penn State and the opportunity ahead to do something to win the kind of games that James Franklin has not been able to win at Penn State. But again, for Notre Dame, they just won that, right? Like they won the game that their program had not been able to do for a couple of decades here. So you've got an elite defense on one side, you've got an offense with a lot of weapons, but again, maybe some questions about how Andy Kotelnicki is going to call the game. How do you big picture thoughts on the Orange Bowl semifinal?
I think it comes down to the defenses for either one of the teams. And I look at Penn State, they're built well in the front seven, and they need to be going up against Notre Dame because the strength of Notre Dame is the run game. It's more of a challenge because Notre Dame's personnel is better than Boise State, and you have to focus on more than just the running back. You have to be able to account for the quarterback, and that becomes a challenge too. But I think if Penn State can dominate with their front, the pathway for Notre Dame becomes much more narrow because we might actually have to see that game where Riley Leonard has to drop back and win on his arm. I flip it over to the other side. Notre Dame's secondary should have no problems bottling up Penn State's wide receivers. That group is not great to me. But I look at what Penn State has been able to do and the way that their run game has come on. They start leaning on dudes, right? And like they did it against Oregon, the Big Ten championship. They had some huge runs there. And then again, in particular, the inside run for them against Boise State was a really good play. And I think Notre Dame's going to have to be able to say, okay, we're going to trust our secondary to get the job done. And we're going to have to figure out with our front how we're going to handle some of the quarterback run that they like to do, but the two-headed monster at running back. So I think the defenses are going to be the thing that will win or lose the game in the Orange Bowl.
We'll keep tabs too on Jeremiah Love's health and what he will be, if he will be available in the Orange Bowl, and what percentage. He said he wasn't close to 100%, which he doesn't need to be an amazing factor in this game. But we'll continue to see that some elite running backs in this game for sure. Cotton Bowl, I will be there. I'm excited for this heavyweight fight. Texas, not too far from Austin, getting to play this game against the Buckeyes. Ohio State favored right now, again, as of Friday morning, 6.5 points. Feels right, considering what we just saw from the Buckeyes. The keys to this one, I feel like, first off, there's going to be a lot of narratives about Quinn Ewers, who did technically start his college career at Ohio State. But the questions I've got is, Ohio State's been so dominant on both sides of the ball. I mean, I don't know if they're going to be able to be close to 100% still on offense and defense, but what's the formula, the big picture formula for Texas to stay in the game? That we're there to talk ourselves into this being a good game for how Texas can pull off an upset, win this game, or at least keep it close against a team that really has been firing on all cylinders.
All right, I'm gonna be the guy who does this. This is the game where I think Arch Manning needs to have a package or two. The reason I say this is I watched Ohio State against Tennessee. The only thing that hurt them was Nico using his legs, right? Like when he ran, that was the best offense that Tennessee had. You go back to when Ohio State played Oregon the first time, Dylan Gabriel had some really timely runs, right? I'm looking at when Ohio State played Nebraska. Dylan Raiola, who's not even a runner, was able to extend drives with his legs in that game. And to me, Quinn Ewers, between the ankle injury, and I think he's just a guy who is like very averse to getting hit because he's been injured before. I don't think it would maximize the thing that could hurt Ohio State's defense the most. So I'm not saying take Quinn Ewers out the game, but I think they should be prepared to have some packages where Arch can come in and be a little bit more dynamic using his legs, and especially with the running back room, who's done a phenomenal job with their injuries. But it ain't the running back room that they expected coming into the year. So I would say that's point number one for Texas. Point number two, I think they have to try to find ways to take the football away. Will Howard has been very comfortable throwing the football.
Extremely.
The ball still sails at times, right? Like a ball will be in the air and Jeremiah will go up and make a great play and Mecca will make a great play. Sometimes the accuracy isn't exactly where it needs to be. When the ball is up for grabs, and Texas has a really good secondary. These are two of the highest paid rosters in college football, by the way. Very talented teams that we're going to be looking at here. I think they've got to be able to capitalize on some of the havoc plays that they could create defensively against this Ohio State offense that has been unstoppable in the 2 games we've seen them in the college football playoff.
All these teams are 1 win away from playing for a championship, 2 wins away from winning it. What's really cool as well is that no matter what happens here, there will be a first-time national championship winning head coach. None of the 4 head coaches still alive have won this thing before. Very, very cool. And we will go deeper into the Cotton and the Orange Bowl previews a little bit later this week here on Rushing the Field. So subscribe, rate, review, hang out with us. We have so much more to come here the rest of the postseason. Appreciate the time. Wishing everyone again a happy and healthy new year. And we will be back for a semifinal preview pod later this week. For Joshua, I'm Nicole. Thanks for listening.